Good evening, viewers. Welcome to this teleconferencing session on Subaltern Studies. Subaltern Studies, well, to get to the topic right away, which is something which we should always do, and that is the Subaltern Studies is actually a trend of history writing which emerged in India in the 1980s. In the 1980s, what happened was that there was a reaction developing to the existing nationalist and Marxist historiography which was in existence. Though of course they had done a lot of work and a lot of unearthing of the nature of mass movements during nationalism, the national movement, the various kinds of participation of various groups in the national movement. All that had been quite extensively investigated. But the reaction was to a precise point. The reaction was that the Subaltern Studies School highlighted, namely Ranjit Guha, the main leader of the Subaltern Studies School, highlighted, was that both the nationalist and the Marxist historiography had developed a blind spot. Now, what was this blind spot? How come historians who were so who were so eminent in their own fields were actually working with a blind spot? The Subaltern Studies School came up sharply and said, look, what you are doing is you are basically investigating what the national movement was all about, who participated in it, and how India got freedom from colonialism and so on. But in this you were leaving out the agency of the main actors of the national movement, that is the mass of the people, as to how they were makers of their own history. This was the point which they put sharply across to the nationalist and the Marxist historians. I mean, look at Marxist historians. What were they doing, for example? They had branded all kinds of peasant and the tribal protests during the national movement's time in classical Marxian tradition of calling it a pre-political protest. The Subaltern Studies School objected precisely to this word pre-political. What do you mean by pre-political, they asked. Can you basically, they said, go by this whole argument that the agency of the party or a political party or a political organization leading a mass movement is supreme, and that any movement which falls outside that is pre-political? Now, this is the question which they raised, and for this they turned away from the kind of records which the historians of the nationalists and the Marxist schools are looking at, that is the documents available at national level of both colonial government and the nationalist organizations, and they turned to records which were more close to the people's activities, as it were, which included British records, of course, at the district collector record office. They collected folk tales, folk stories, diaries written by ordinary people living in various kasbahs and so on. And on the basis of they tried to reconstruct nature of mass movements as they occurred at the local level, at the district level, at the taluka level, at the village level, and they tried to find out as to what exactly was prompting them to get associated or rise up in revolt against the British or rise up in revolt as such. What was the reason? Was it only colonial exploitation, or was it exploitation of the existing class structure in which they found themselves? These are the questions which they raised very succinctly, and to a large extent they brought out 10 volumes like these. This is the Subaltern Studies Volume 1. They brought out 10 volumes like these, and they basically, in these volumes, they excavated a number of protests in various districts and various local levels in India, and tried to focus on the question of the agency of the various peasant tribal movements as well as workers movements, where they try to restore and recover the agency of the subaltern groups themselves. They try to bring out how these people were makers of their own history. to a certain extent, this exercise was quite successful in terms of locating local protests and bringing them to the fore and locating the agency of the people to the fore. But then a criticism has always been of the subaltern school that they have not been able to integrate these various protests into any kind of a theoretical understanding of how these protests, which were disparate, how could they be linked in any particular manner. Sumit Sarkar, one of the contributors to Subaltern School who came from a Marxist background, did try that. He posited a concept of a parallel national movement, as it were, in his essay on colonial, in his small essay on Duskar lectures, where he examined this question of leadership and colonial movement and subaltern movements. There he posited some kind of a parallel movement, the possibilities of parallel movement, which these protests, these disparate protests indicated. But then this was the only theoretical attempt. Within the subaltern school, Ranjit Guha or Dipesh Chakrabarti and eminent scholars of that kind did not posit any kind of an attempt to link up. Of course, the point of departure within the subaltern school, as these volumes were coming into press, was also the writing of the writing of Ranjit Guha, the leading subaltern historian, where he wrote a book called Elementary Aspects of Peasant Insurgency in Colonial India. And there he tried to bring out what were the features of this so-called pre-political protests. And he demonstrated to a large extent, successfully, though he has his own critics, he demonstrated how elements like negativity, solidarity, community, transmission and so on contribute to actually making a political consciousness in the subaltern's mind. This is my brief introduction. Of course, I would also want to say that this attempt was, of course, went a great deal in also contributing to a general understanding of social science, which was entrapped in some kind of a behaviorist mode of stimulus and response. That basically colonial institutions, that the nationalists, for example, were responding to colonialist institutions and building up a national movement and things of that kind. It went beyond the stimulus response theory to posit a broader understanding of what the question of agency of the subaltern actors in protests and everyday life means. But these are questions which I will be taking up in a question-answer form, as I have with me an expert on this area who has been working on this for a number of years, and he'll be throwing light on the nature of this subaltern studies movement and what its contributions are. This is Dr. Shashibhushan Upadhyay. He's there as a colleague in the Faculty of History at IGNOU, and he'll be speaking for, say, about 20 odd minutes, giving his understanding, and then we'll have a discussion of some kind. In between, if you have any questions, if you have any queries, please do ask them, because we'll be more than we'll more than welcome it. Because this is a question which actually needs to be debated and at length and understood as an important or integral part of your study of Indian history in the national movement time. So, over to Dr. Upadhyay.
Thank you, Ajay. First, let me clarify one thing, that this particular discussion we are going to have, this belongs to our MA course in history, and that course is MHI 3, Historiography. So it's a part of that. Subaltern Studies, as Mr. Ajay Mahurkar has pointed out, that it was a series of volumes brought out initially under the editorship of Ranjit Guha and later by other members of the Subaltern Collective. And we are going to focus our discussion on this series of volumes. To start with, let me historically trace the growth of the term subaltern. What does subaltern mean? In later medieval England, we find that the term subaltern was referred to, it was used for the serfs, meaning peasants. Later on, during the 17th or 18th century, it started to be used for soldiers of inferior rank in the army. So the inferior rank soldiers were called subalterns. Foot soldiers, they were called subalterns. Later on, it was used in a very radical manner by Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian Marxist, when he was in jail and he was writing his prison diary. Gramsci used the term subaltern in a very radical and a novel manner. And he used it to substitute the term class. It had two reasons. One, that he found in the term subaltern a kind of theoretical validity, a theoretical conceptual grasp which could deal with various sections in society who have been oppressed and subordinated. Secondly, because he was writing in the prison and his writings were seen by the prison authority, he could not use the term class because then they'll object to his writing anything. So use the term subaltern to substitute it for the term working class, oppressed groups, oppressed classes. Now when the term came to be used in India initially by Ranjit Guha and his colleagues, it was used in Gramscian sense only as people of oppressed groups. Nevertheless, it was different in certain respects. For one, Ranjit Guha used it not to mean class, but in a more broader, expanded manner. And that broader manner meant that he used it for all the people who were not elites. So taking a sociological category of elite, he counterposed it to the category of subaltern. So instead of saying, as the Marxist would say, working class, capitalist class, or middle class, he used two terms, subaltern and elite. The term elite has been used in sociology for a long time, but his counterposing of these two terms, subaltern and elite, was a new. It was new. It was in a novel manner that he used this. Secondly, he said that all the people in the Indian society, minus the elite, were subalterns. So he said that the demographic difference between the total Indian population and the elite are the subalterns. So in a way, he meant that anybody who is not an elite is a subaltern. Now, who is an elite? The elite were people in the colonial India. Elite were people like the British, who were the rulers. They were the elite. Then the dominant classes, like landlords, capitalists, who were wealthy people, as well as they were allies of the British. They were also elite. And some part of the middle classes, upper middle classes, were also, particularly in bureaucracy and army, they were also elite. The rest were subalterns. Secondly, Ranjit Guha, when he tried to conceptualize the theme of subaltern studies, or to say in another way, to ground the manifesto of the subaltern studies series, he said that all the history writings till now have been the history writing concerned with the elite. That is, it means that it has all been elitist history writing. Now he said that these elitist history writings have been two kinds. One is that colonial elitism and another is bourgeois nationalist elitism. Although Ajay also brought in Marxist historiography, and Ranjit Guha was critical of Marxist historiography also to a certain extent, he did not go a long way in criticizing Marxist historiography, because he also came from a background which had the tools of Marxist analysis in his repertoire. So we see that Ranjit Guha was basically against colonial elitist historiography and bourgeois nationalist elitist historiography. Now he criticized these historiography because he said they have failed to take into account the politics of the people. And as Ajay was pointing out, that both these historiography considered that all kinds of mass movements, peasant movements, tribal movements, movement of the common people, they were pre-political in nature. What the subaltern historians said, that the movements of the ordinary people, common people, or the masses, peasants, working class, they were not pre-political, they were very much political in nature. And therefore, they said that the earlier historiography had failed to take into account the politics of the people. So what the subaltern studies wanted to do was to take the politics of the people into account. The politics of the people meant that the agency of the people had to be established, and that meant that the people, the masses, were the makers of their own history. This theme had to be grounded. Thus we have three themes, all in continuation with each other. One is that politics of the people have to be founded, it had to be established, it had to be recognized. Secondly, that agency of the people have to be recognized. And thirdly, that it has to be considered that the people were the makers of their own history. It's not that somebody else is making their own history. What the other historiography did, what the three kinds of historiography which existed before subaltern studies, the colonial historiography took that it was in the nature of the colonialism to enlighten the colonized. So that was the part of their master narrative, the attempt to colonize, to enlighten the colonized people. The master narrative of the bourgeois nationalist historiography was to establish that all the mass movements, everything which happened during the colonial period was a progression towards making of the nation state. So it was politically integrated to the making of the nation state. And the Marxist historiography considered that the people's movement were moving towards revolution, towards the making of the socialist state. So these people's movement or the people's rebellion were not a theme in themselves, but they were a part of a different narrative. They were a part of either making of the colonialism, or the enlightenment of the colonial enlightenment of the people, or the making of the nation state, or the making of the socialist state, a total revolution. So we find that what the subaltern historians wanted to do was to see for the people's initiative in the revolt, in the rebellion, and to read in itself what kind of initiative consisted in making a particular rebellion, not as a part of a certain master narrative, but a narrative in itself. So with this theme, the Subaltern Studies project started. Now, in the overall Subaltern Studies project, which is now about 12 volumes old, we can delineate two phases. One phase, the first phase, was the phase in which subaltern versus elite was posed. In the second phase, they moved on to discourse analysis. The basic characteristics of the first phase was, one, the sympathy for the subaltern, not sympathy but to explore the agency of the subaltern, to interrogate this agency vis-a-vis the elite, and thirdly, to locate an autonomous domain for the subaltern action. So this was part of the initial project, which continued till about 6 volumes, till about when the 6 volumes were brought out. After that, the nature of the project began to change. It now became discourse analysis. Discourse textual analysis. What it meant was that now it concentrated not on the actual research about the subaltern people, about the masses, about the peasantry or the working class, women, whoever they considered subaltern for that matter. But they started taking the colonial texts as a base for their analysis. And initially they were impressed by Marx and Gramsci and Marxist social historians in England and France. In the later period, the influence became a postmodernist and the post-colonialist. Foucault, Edward Said and others became important figures in the category of influences. So these were the two phases of subaltern studies, which is now generally recognized. Now coming with the first phase, which brought the subaltern studies to the fore and grounded most of its historians. Here they emphasized an autonomous domain of the subaltern and their dissociation, and the dissociation of this domain from the domain of bourgeois nationalist activity. Here the dominant Congress nationalism or the Congress movement was not seen as the only form of nationalism present in colonial India. In fact, it was seen as the dominant form which tried to subjugate the people, took them into their fold, tried to take them into Congress fold in order to be successful in the formation of the nation state. Now they said there was another domain of nationalism, which was the popular domain. And this domain not only did not coincide with the Congress domain or the dominant nationalist domain, but it also was in opposition to it. Many of the themes, many of the initiatives it took was in opposition to this national domain. Now the subaltern historians were quite successful in criticizing the Congress politics, taking on the dominant nationalist politics. But when they tried to locate the popular subaltern domain, there was a problem. The problem was that there were not much records available which could be said to belong to the people. It was very hard to find any records so far as their own records, like we find in the case of Europe. In the third world countries, it was very difficult to find any such records. So now what they did is they tried to see the dominant records, the colonial records and the middle class records, and tried to read them against the grain, between the lines. And it was this that constituted their basis for asserting an autonomous domain for the masses. Now it had a problem. The problem was that it did not bring out the subaltern voice to the fore. It only sought to create a particular voice from other records, from other voices. For example, if you find a colonial text, suppose a Nehru or Gandhi or some other leader, when they were writing, a colonial official, when they were writing about people, so the subaltern historians try to read them and try to find what they have to say about the people and how the people's voices were reflected through them. So there was no direct evidence of people's voice. And it became so stark that later on Gayatri Spivak tried to theorize this situation by saying that the subalterns can't speak. Though what Spivak meant had a circular reasoning, because it tried to impute a kind of a speechlessness on subalterns, because as soon as the subalterns started speaking, they ceased to be subaltern. So obviously they could not speak. But it had a problem in the grounding also, actual situation also, because pre-discourse subalterns could not be located. And this discourse was either colonial discourse or nationalist discourse, a middle class discourse. Before that, there was no voice of the subaltern. It was not coming through directly to any of the historians. This problem this constraint forced them to, after a point of time when they had exhausted writing about subalterns, reading through other texts, then they were forced to move into other direction, and that direction was the direction of the discourse analysis. Now I'll stop it here, and then I'll take up the discourse analysis later on. And I think if there are any questions, you might ask the questions. If Ajay has anything to say on this, probably he can put forward his points.
Fine. I mean, I'll repeat the call for questions. I mean, if you are there and listening, please do ask the question. Ask your questions. We have still about 15 minutes to go. And now I find this. I find this division of subaltern studies into two interesting. I mean, I would rather characterize it as three divisions, because in between, while making a start from investigating the autonomous domain of popular movements, there is a phase which comes with Sumit Sarkar and so on, which basically tries to integrate theoretically into a paradigm the nature, these autonomous movements, which was not the case in the first instance, in the first position of the subaltern studies. I mean, if you this is a text which is outside, of course, the subaltern studies volumes, which the Deuskar lectures, but it is significant. It is significant in the sense that it is actually trying to give space to a history from above as well, in the sense that basically saying, look, you cannot do a history from below without a history from above. Basically, that means basically you need to theoretically integrate your findings of popular struggles and popular movement somewhere along the line, and then only move on. Of course, discourse analysis comes later. I think when the impetus for examining the autonomous domain peters out, perhaps, or does not find adequate kind of takers in the subaltern group itself. And but it's a phase which is at the tail end, where basically questions of more kind of hair splitting about whether things is done, and I don't think anything concrete comes out as far as the subaltern studies project's earlier vision of itself was concerned.
I'll answer it by saying that actually, although there were local level analysis and local level research, there have been attempts right from the beginning to theorize the whole project, and right from the first volume, in the preface of the first volume, Ranjit Guha tried to provide a kind of meta theory for subaltern studies project. This he concretized later on his Prose of Counter-Insurgency in volume 2, and in his book The Elementary Aspects of Peasant Insurgency in Colonial India. Partha Chatterjee did it in his Nationalist Thought and Colonial World, though from a different perspective. So there have been attempts right since beginning to theorize the subaltern studies. It's not that there were no attempts for that. And this attempt in its entirety tried to posit an autonomous domain for the subalterns, which was different. For example, Ranjit Guha, when he is writing Elementary Aspects of Peasant Insurgencies, he and Prose of Counter-Insurgency, and in many prefaces, he tries to pose various differences between the subaltern domain and the elite domain. For one, he said that elite domain was based on legalistic politics, legalistic mobilization, while subaltern domain was relatively more prone to violence. Secondly, the subaltern domain was rooted in traditional, religious, territorial themes, territorial and these kind of it was rooted in these things, which was territorial, religious, traditional, while the elite domain was more rooted in the modern kind of politics, like democratic politics, party, mobilization, and all these kind of things. Thirdly, he says that while the elite mobilization was vertical, going from the top leadership to the down leadership, to the masses and cadres, the subaltern mobilization was horizontal. And fourthly, he said that while the subaltern mobilization, subaltern reaction, protest was spontaneous, the elite protest was more careful, it was guarded. So right from the beginning, he tried to say that these two domains were separate, and he tried to theorize it. So there was a very clear separation posited. In theory,
in the beginning, yes.
in the beginning, right in the beginning, that there were two domains, one subaltern domain and another elite domain. In fact, Sumit Sarkar also, in his earlier article on the conditions and nature of subaltern militancy,
Volume 3.
He says that the subaltern domain was distinct from the elite domain. What all these historians meant, that while the elite domain was trying to mobilize the subalterns, they were creating their imageries, they were creating their charisma. Nevertheless, these were not charismatic leaders who were important in mobilizing the people. It's the people who tried to interpret the charisma, who tried to put their meanings onto various nationalist symbols. So in that respect, it was important, like Shahid Amin's study of Mahatma Gandhi as Mahatma. So here we see that how the peasantry, how the people, common masses, they tried to interpret Gandhi's messages, which were not necessarily Gandhi's voice. They tried to put their own interpretation in Gandhi's voice, and they acted accordingly, which led to the Chauri Chaura incidents, in which 22 policemen were killed, because they felt that it was Mahatma Gandhi who was trying to tell them that go for these kind of actions, which Gandhi never said. So that means that they said that the people were trying to put their own interpretations on the nationalist symbols, nationalist politics, nationalist charismatic leaders. So that separation they have been trying to, like Stephen Hinningham, when he wrote on Quit India movement in Bihar, so he said there were two distinct domains. One was the elite domain, elite mobilization of middle class leaders, middle class classes from the cities, dominant classes in the villages, rural areas like landlords and rich peasants. And another was the popular mobilizations of poor peasant, lower middle peasants, the agricultural laborers. And because these two domains were distinct, it was easy to suppress them. So this has been a constant theme in the subaltern studies, that there were two domains and they were distinct. So it was theoretically said. I mean, if you have any other instance, I think...
No, I mean, of course, two domains were. I'm not disagreeing with the domains being posited as a distinct one. But there was an attempt to integrate within the Deuskar lectures a very important thing. I mean, as you rightly pointed out, that Gramsci was an important kind of influence on the formulation of the concept of subaltern studies. Sumit Sarkar brought in Gramsci to basically bring out as to what exactly was the interlinkage between the domain of elite Congress politics and the popular politics which was posited by the subalterns. He brings in the concept of passive revolution, for example. He brings in the concept of passive revolution. Passive revolution basically meant that it's not that these two domains are separate, but that these two domains intersect, the elite and subaltern domains intersect, and Congress devises strategies basically to usurp the energies which are generated by popular movements for its own ends. This was passive revolution. This was passive revolution, and this was the concept actually linking the subaltern and the elite domain, which I think is a position which comes out somewhere in between. Before there is a thrust of subaltern movement which moves towards discourse analysis. And I think this needs to be recognized as a distinct kind of a phase of theorization, which is distinct from what is posited in the manifesto in the first volume, or in the prose of counterinsurgency, or also in what is said in elementary aspects of peasant insurgency.
Yeah, I mean, that is true. And it's not that only this theme was there. Right from the beginning, there was another theme running. Earlier it was in minority, like Partha Chatterjee's earlier writings, national, nationalism, nationalist thought and colonial world, and later on Nation and the Fragments. There has been attempt on the part of Partha Chatterjee to provide a kind of relationship with the power knowledge, the dominance of the power knowledge in colonial context. It's overwhelming predominance, and that derived somehow from the postmodernist and postcolonialist thinking, which became a dominant mode of writing in the later phase of subaltern studies. Now we see that there are certain distinctions which were made. Earlier it was the subaltern versus the elite of various kinds, both internal and external, both colonial elite and the nationalist elite, that the whole analysis was posed. Now in the later phase, it was not the elite and subaltern, it was the whole nation was considered as subaltern and colonialism was considered as elite. Tradition was considered as subaltern and modernity was considered as elite. Enlightenment was considered as elite form, and anti-enlightenment tradition of various fragments, they were considered as subaltern. So there was a difference now posed, not between the subaltern and elite of every kind, but between tradition and modernity, between nation and colonialism, between fragment and universalization of enlightenment tradition.
Okay.
So we find that a different shift starts taking place. So all the, like Dipesh Chakrabarty says in his various writings, that the history we are reading is a kind of European history. Even when we are reading Indian history, in fact we are reading the European history, because the thematics is the same. So the whole of nation, third world, has become a kind of subaltern so far as Europe is concerned. So Europe, enlightenment, modernity, they remain the elite forms. So this is a kind of post-colonialist interpretation in which various forms of dominances and superordination and subordination in the third world, inside the third world, inside the nation state, that have been sought to be papered over. So a kind of theme develops in which everything, and there has been overall emphasis on the overwhelming predominance of the power knowledge, in which the colonial dominance through its knowledge had become all powerful, in which it dominates all kind of nationalists, all kind of the knowledge of the nation. So anything starting with the subaltern domain in colony or the elite domain in the colony, they have been somehow been dominated by the colonial power knowledge until and unless they are part of the traditional framework, traditional ideology. So we find that there is no difference even in protest. Even in protest, it is said that the nationalists tried to emulate the colonialists. So we find that there has been this kind of shift, which is part of the second phase of the development of the subaltern studies.
Okay. I mean, I would also, since we are now going to take leave of our students and no questions have been forthcoming, you could fax your questions, you could send your queries through fax and so on. But meanwhile, I'll just take up an additional point of interest which I noticed today while reading the manifesto again of Subaltern Studies, which probably has a bearing on the kind of situations we find ourselves in. Ranjit Guha's critique of the nationalist and the Marxist historiography was also a critique of what he called a behaviorist model of nationalism which they had adopted. Okay. I mean, behaviorism is a familiar theme to education, people in education and so on. History is not very much used. But he says basically he characterizes in the manifesto that there is a behaviorist tradition which behaviorist tradition of doing nationalism which comes up where basically the nationalist elites are regarded as responding to colonial institutions, colonial ideas and ideologies and so on. And I mean, you know, in some kind of a stimulus response, the colonial ideologies give out, or colonial ideas or colonial power knowledge nexus gives out some kind of a gives out some kind of knowledge or whatever, or resources or whatever, and basically the Indian elite basically responds to it, and basically thereby it gets into kind of a association which is of stimulus and response, and this is what actually defines what he says elite nationalism. Would you want to respond to it very quickly so that we can just
I think of course he meant that not that all the writings have been like that before, and it's not that the Subaltern Studies was the first to point. There have been a long tradition of history from below in India as well as worldwide, which tried to emphasize the agency of the masses. Secondly, the nationalism had various varieties, and it had several strands. It worked on several levels. Even the dominant nationalism, what we call dominant nationalism, it worked at several levels. So I think his criticism was valid to a certain extent, but it's not that he was entirely right in saying that. I think we are reaching the end of our time.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Padhyay. It's been a very interesting session. I mean, at least for me, and I have learned a lot. I mean, in the end, I would say that we took you through some kind of a tour de force of the Subaltern Studies history writing, which is a trend which developed in 1980s, and I made a distinction between two phases, and Dr. Padhyay made a distinction between three phases. I think he is right. I mean, I have learned that basically that we obviously that discourse analysis phase of Subaltern Studies needs to be taken into. I mean, obviously needs to be taken into account. In the process, what we have done is basically we have tried to bring to you a phase or a chapter in Indian history writing which basically took up the questions of agency in a very, very forthright fashion. Agency of the people as makers of their own history. It's an important departure point. Whatever your viewpoint, wherever you are standing, whether you're a nationalist or a Marxist or maybe you sympathize with the imperialist historiography, but wherever you are standing, this aspect of Indian history writing can no longer be ignored. I mean, people as makers of their own history has an important kind of a bearing on any kind of a history writing, wherever history writing takes place. And the features of these history writing, some of them we have tried to highlight, and hopefully we in the next round of teleconferencing will definitely have a question answer session. I mean, hope springs eternally, and thank you very much. We wind up the session now.